The Tennessee Pass Line in Colorado has been part of the Southern Pacific System since 1988. Before then, this passage was operated by the Rio Grande, a colorful and interesting railroad that can trace its beginnings here to the 1870s. In 1996, the Union Pacific took control of the Southern Pacific, and this includes the former Rio Grande Tennessee Pass Line. This latest rail merger has placed uncertainty on any future operations in the pass, and this video captures what may be the final phase of activities here. But before reviewing the present, we'll explore a little history of the line's beginnings. Colorado was originally an area that consisted of pieces of Kansas, Utah, and Nebraska territories. Colorado was admitted into the Union in 1876, 100 years after the country's birth. A large portion of the state consists of mountainous areas that challenge development. Most of the larger cities are east of this range, known as the Rockies. The development of Colorado was eventually boosted by mining, especially the notoriety of gold mining. The Colorado Gold Rush of 1859 was 10 years after the old California Gold Rush, which had finally run its course. This new chance for prosperity brought many Easterners and even some California 49ers to the territory. Many communities, both large and small, were formed from rugged mining camps, and we'll visit some of these smaller towns later on. Gold deposits weren't the only discoveries. Eventually, silver, copper, lead, and many other mines were developed. The mining activity brought new wealth and a need for transporting supplies in and or out from remote places. This need was first filled by pack animals, followed by wagon teams on crude roads, and finally by railroads. The best known of these railroads was the Denver and Rio Grande, created by the efforts of General William Palmer. This line radiated all through Colorado and the challenging mountains. The original but unrealized dream was to reach El Paso, Texas, and extend the line south to a Mexican connection, and ultimately the Pacific. General Palmer worked in various capacities for the Kansas Pacific, another component of the Union Pacific Railroad, and while working there he put together a dream of a Colorado-based rail empire, including officers from his experience in the Civil War as trusted assistants. The workers would be filled from the best of the enlisted ranks, and everyone would own stock in the company. They would therefore be all well motivated and part of some utopian community or the ideal railroad. During Palmer's rail travels back east, he happened to sit across from an Eastern lawyer with financial connections. William Proctor Mellon listened with interest as Palmer outlined his plan of business and growth opportunities in Colorado. This fortunate meeting eventually brought Palmer in contact with British development money through Dr. William Bell of Liverpool. This chance meeting also provided an introduction to Palmer's future wife, Mary Lincoln Mellon, Mellon's daughter. The DNRG original building phase was all narrow gauge, since the smaller equipment was more suitable in the construction of track and mountains and narrow ravines. Bridges and tunnels also were more economical to build for the lighter, narrow-gauge equipment. Ironically, the locomotive here on the point is a remnant of the ill-fated 1983 merger of the Santa Fe and the SP. The paint scheme was nicknamed the Kodachrome, based on the color of the film boxes consumed by so many rail fans taking photographs. The lettering was SPSF for Southern Pacific Santa Fe. After the terminated merger, SP quickly painted the SF initials off their locomotives, while Santa Fe painted out the SP initials. If that merger had been allowed to stand, it would be interesting to speculate the present-day ownership of the Tennessee Pass line. The Tennessee Pass almost became a permanent feature of the Santa Fe Railroad in the 1880s, but for a few twists of fate. Instead of seeing these trains representing the merger of the Rio Grande and the Southern Pacific here today, it could easily have been Santa Fe engines on this Kansas City to Roseville, California train. The Rio Grande and the Santa Fe were rivals, even enemies to the extreme, in the beginning days, and that's a story in itself. The biggest worry was the building of the Santa Fe Railroad by the able and well-financed leadership of William B. Strong. Just like the DNRG, they too had designs on connections to Mexico and the Pacific Ocean to link eastern trade to the west and beyond to the Orient. The Santa Fe had already extended its line from Kansas to La Junta, Colorado, and beat out the DNRG through Raton Pass to tap New Mexico and markets below the border. The rivalry of the DNRG with the Santa Fe was most intense in the Royal Gorge, leading to the Tennessee Pass. The old name for the Royal Gorge was the Grand Canyon of the Arkansas River, using the Spanish spelling of canyon. It was here that armed bands of men, many described as thugs from Kansas, had confrontations. Guns were just as important as shovels here, since it was obvious that there wasn't room through the gorge for two railroads and one would have to abandon its plans. Many of the towns in the area sided with one railroad or the other as battles went on through court actions. The towns were concerned with rate fixing when one road had an exclusive to an area. Both roads took advantage of the situation at times. The battle went on for several years, and Santa Fe actually built portions of the line first. The DNRG lost control over the line for a while and was paid by the Santa Fe for its use. Eventually, the DNRG regained full control over the Royal Gorge to the Tennessee Pass and became the dominant player in Colorado, but its hopes of connections to Mexico and the Pacific were finished. The Santa Fe had this dream secured for itself by occupying and conquering Raton Pass into New Mexico, almost as if the battle for the Royal Gorge had been a deliberate distraction. Eventually, the Santa Fe would trade its Mexican connections to the Southern Pacific for tracks into California. The 1880 Tripartite Treaty between the Union Pacific, Santa Fe, and DNRG gave the DNRG a 10-year exclusive on rail building into the Colorado Mountains in exchange for the DNRG limiting itself to penetration no further south than Trinidad or Espanola, New Mexico. The DNRG would concentrate on the booming mining activities and essentially remain a regional carrier limited to Colorado, Utah, and the very northern extremity of New Mexico. The DNRG was consolidated by William Palmer with the standard gauge DNRG-W, which provided a connection west to Salt Lake City, Utah. In 1889, the Rio Grande started converting much of its narrow gauge trackage to standard gauge, with a number of smaller feeder lines remaining as narrow gauge holdouts to the end. We'll visit some of these narrow gauge remnants down the line a ways. The completion of the Tennessee Pass line and the Moffat line would come later. The standard gauge Rio Grande eventually became a successful regional competitor, a company capable of even buying the larger Southern Pacific Railroad shortly after the SP and Santa Fe merger was denied by the federal government. SP was weakened by this government decision, and SP fans were somewhat relieved when Rio Grande locomotives were repainted in SP colors, not the other way around. Apparently, the Rio Grande, the new owners of the SP, felt that the SP colors and name had more marketing utility. The SP presence in Tennessee Pass, since the 1988 merger into the Rio Grande, has produced a greater variety of trains with lots of older Rio Grande units intermixed with SP engines, as well as leased and pool power units. The future of this line is in doubt now, since the UP has bought the SP and Rio Grande combination in 1996. The steep 3% grades of the eastern slope of this line and the need for helper operations just may not fit UP's style of railroading. The government has indicated willingness to allow all the Tennessee Pass traffic onto the Moffat line if UP can demonstrate that it can be done with no disruptions to traffic flow in the region. Union Pacific seems to prefer short and fast trains without the need for helpers. A case in point is the Sema Hill in California with its 2.2% grades, and you won't see helpers on UP trains here. Other than a short 3-mile section at Pueblo, the main line we'll visit is all single track and mostly jointed rail. CTC controls train movements with 26 sidings, and 8 of them are over 8,000 feet in length. Our journey will take us on 181 miles of Subdivision 3 to Minturn, a crew change and helper location. traveling 40 miles further westward over a portion of Subdivision 4 of the Rio Grande system, we'll see the Y at Dotsero, where trains tie into the Moffat route between Grand Junction and Denver, Colorado. We begin our review of Tennessee Pass at the eastern end of the city of Pueblo. The yard here is a crew change point, and the Union Station is a pleasant place to watch trains of not only the Southern Pacific and Union Pacific, but BNSF as well. You're likely to see locomotives from SP, UP, Santa Fe, and numerous foreign power examples at this picturesque station location. The station was designed by a Chicago-based firm of Sprague & Newell, and it was completed in 1890. The original cost of $400,000 was a tremendous sum of money at the time for this combination hotel, restaurant, and station. The depot originally had a clock tower some 30 feet higher, but structural damage from a flood in 1925 was responsible for its reduced height of 120 feet. The last passenger train to stop here was Santa Fe train number 200 in April 1971 with the coming of the Amtrak age. No service has been restored since then. But on a brighter note, a group of investors purchased the station in 1990, and with years of restoration work costing several $1,000,000, they've brought in a number of businesses to a property that brings renewed pride to Pueblo. The project has encouraged other restorations in the nearby businesses, and the area is now one that brings many visitors to Union Avenue. The reminders that this was once Rio Grande territory are everywhere but fading fast. Even these cabooses parked here awaiting their final trip to the scrapyard are outnumbered by SP cabooses waiting a similar fate. This BNSF coal train is heading for the Joint Line, which runs north to Denver. Just a few miles north of here, we'll visit a BN train waiting for a green to run north. The Joint Line is a double track from Pueblo, running north through Colorado Springs and into Denver. This line is shared by the Rio Grande and Southern Pacific trains, as well as the Santa Fe and Burlington Northern trains. As the merger of these lines takes hold, it'll be an all UP and BNSF show eventually. The U-boat mixed in here and lettered for the Metra commuter railroad in New Jersey was the surprise of the day. Back to the line heading for Tennessee Pass, we find a westbound empty coal train crossing the Arkansas River at Portland, Colorado near milepost 145. Portland is named after the process of making cement invented in Portland, England. The Ideal Cement Company has a plant here that's switched, and various tracks are owned by the Rio Grande, the Santa Fe, and the Cement Company. This is the back edge of the town of Florence, named for the daughter of a local oil refiner named James McCandless. The tracks here cross State Highway 115 in a setting of ranches and small farms. Here at Canyon City on a gloomy rainy day, a westbound taconite train runs by, while on the other side of the road crossing, the local, with a single 1972-built Jeep 40, waits to run east, back to Pueblo. Our second camera on the other side of the crossing picks the action back up as the Jeep 40 pulls a short train of empties on by. Access is difficult to the bottom of the canyon, and spectators have to be content with views from up above on the 1929-built suspension bridge. Shooting trains in here requires an extreme telephoto lens, and you only get about 1 hour of usable light due to the canyon's depth. The narrow canyon with its steep walls and river bring back images of the Santa Fe and the DNRG battling for the toehold that would only allow one track through here. This 1953 timetable features the beauty of this scenic but difficult line with a picture of the Royal Gorge and a Rio Grande passenger train that ran from Denver westward to Salt Lake and Ogden, Utah. Parkdale along US 50, and we spot an eastbound with a pair of AC 4400s on a rainy afternoon. Down the siding, a westbound taconite train waits. Several minutes later, the main is cleared for the taconite train and a pair of mid-train helpers, also AC 4400s. Keeping the slack from the rear of the train is an additional lone AC 4400. This location is named Spikebuck, referring to young male deer with immature antlers. Spikebuck is another beautiful location, and we're now finally in some sunshine. An eastbound mixed manifest freight with a Union Pacific SD40 on the point waits for an upgrade taconite train to run by. The 4,800-foot-long siding is just enough to allow this short 3,300-foot-long freight to start rolling before the main is cleared. US 50, the Arkansas River, and the tracks all parallel each other for 44 miles to Salida, giving countless locations for picture taking. The river is also open to rafting and fishing. The manifest freight heading east drifts downgrade with the rafters lagging behind. This westbound we're pacing is at Texas Creek, named by a Texan cattle driver who camped here in 1879. Swissvale at milepost 208 and 87 miles west of Pueblo. 94 miles remain to the division point at Minturn. This westbound Kansas City to Roseville vehicle train has a pair of Wisconsin Central pool power units. Salida was once a busy junction off the standard gauge main line into narrow gauge territory that featured a dual gauge yard that could accommodate either type of equipment. This location once gave access to an extensive and diverse southwestern narrow gauge system. The line west from Salida through Gunnison and Black Canyon was originally considered as the route to link the DNRG to Utah. Tennessee Pass was ultimately selected after realizing the difficulties of upgrading this narrow gauge line to standard gauge. The Gunnison narrow gauge line was abandoned in 1955, like so many others. The portion from Montrose east to Gunnison had been removed earlier in sections in the 1949 to 1953 time frame. All of the narrow gauge tracks south of Antonito had already been removed in 1942. These narrow gauge holdouts were all through the southwest portion of Colorado in areas where steep grades, narrow ravines, and economic conditions just wouldn't favor conversion to standard gauge track. There were also numerous competitors such as the Denver South Park and Pacific, Colorado Southern, and Colorado Midland that divided up an economic pie that was all too small at times. The Rio Grande Southern, under Rio Grande control, was one of the many other fragmented narrow gauge operations. This one, connecting the northern end of Rio Grande's narrow gauge system to Durango and other systems in the south, was removed in 1951. The Rio Grande remnants, some in complete isolation, managed to at least outlast all the rest, operating partially into the 50s and 60s. The living remnants of these narrow gauge lines are presently represented by the two tourist operations, the Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad and the Cumbres and Toltec line. These lines were typical of all those through Colorado that helped make many a mine owner wealthy. But these lines always struggled to have some level of financial success of their own. Some of these lines stumbled and staggered into the 60s due to occasional bonanzas of mining and oil discoveries. The preservation of the Durango to Silverton branch was actually helped by tourist passenger operations after World War II by the promotional activities of the Rio Grande's own conductor, Alva Lyons. The Rio Grande knew they now had something of transferable value, and the operation, property, and all the equipment was eventually bought by Charles E. Bradshaw of Orlando, Florida in 1981. This line provides great scenery and a nostalgic good time for over 200,000 patrons every year. The Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad is run by a full staff with the same standards and practices as any modern railroad and is probably in better overall shape than at any time since the beginning. This is a westbound taconite train that originated at Mintac, Minnesota, and it's headed for Geneva Steel in Provo, Utah. Taconite is a type of iron ore that looks like marble-sized pellets. This material is about double the density of coal, and a fully weighted car looks half full compared to a coal load. This 14,000-ton train has a pair of AC 4400s on the point, with 2 ACs 54 cars back. 52 cars more, and we find a trailing AC for a total of 22,000 horsepower. Earlier we saw this SD45 T-2 tunnel motor on the point of a westbound manifest that we pick up again at Princeton Siding. In 19 more miles we'll be at Malta, where the branch line to Leadville and a small yard are located. It's getting dark early on this October afternoon, and we catch one more train today arriving at Malta, a short branch line jaunt from Leadville. Leadville is a few miles up this old branch line from the junction at Malta, and this town was the target of other rail lines in the late 1800s in order to tap into the booming mining business. Leadville was once the second largest town in Colorado and was even considered for being made the state capital. At one time, 40,000 people lived and worked here. Gold was the first discovery in the 1860s, and it was called Oro City then. Not much is left from those days. This was when mules and horses brought in the mining supplies and equipment. The railroad allowed much bigger enterprises to be supplied and built from heavy equipment, and it made shipment of ore much more efficient. Today, the line into town is severed here at the road crossing, isolating the Leadville, Colorado and Southern tourist line. This line takes trips up to Climax, the site of the famous Climax mine, on the old Denver South Park and Pacific line. This line was converted to standard gauge in 1943 by the CB&Q, its owner at the time, and it brought down molybdenum ore to the connecting Rio Grande. The competition was fierce in the late 1800s, and a number of competing lines created what might appear to be duplicate trackage. The town of Leadville had the DNRG, the Denver South Park and Pacific as another narrow gauge competitor, plus the Colorado Midland standard gauge as a rival for the mining business in the area. Much of this business died out, with the cost of extracting remaining deposits being too high to justify operation. This could all change if new veins are discovered or prices rise to justify reopening of mines. Nothing will ever bring back the narrow gauge lines, and rail service to the whole region is threatened now if Union Pacific decides to close Tennessee Pass. Beyond Malta is Leadville Junction, where a second route to Leadville existed until 1940. The second dash line represents the original narrow gauge main line that followed the Tennessee Creek. The present line was rebuilt in 1890 to accommodate conversion to standard gauge. Back on the line in the morning, along the new main near Highway 24, we find a pair of eastbound AC 4400s with a manifest freight. A short time later, a second eastbound follows, powered by an SD40, a GP60, an SD45, and a pair of leased units. Another eastbound drifts down the grade back toward Leadville on an average 1.25% grade with the Oakland to Norfolk Southern forwarder. This is a solid train of 52 empty autorack cars with a fairly light weight of 2,700 tons being held in check with dynamic brakes. In this mix of SD45 and SD40 tunnel motors, we notice that the fourth unit is a repainted ex-cotton belt SD45 T-2. This is the westbound autorack train working upgrade and with loaded cars this time. Ahead is the summit and the East Tunnel portal at the peak of our climb at 10,240 feet. The 2,550-foot-long concrete-lined tunnel was rebored in 1945 to replace a smaller timber-line bore built in 1890. The apex of our climb is actually inside the tunnel, and the Continental Divide cuts right across the tunnel. This is the highest operational main line in the U.S. Highway 24 follows the tracks and goes over the tunnel. On the embankment along the road, we find a set of Rio Grande tunnel motors. The last unit, number 5328, is the oldest of all five, built in 1968, and it seems to have developed a problem. Fortunately, an eastbound up ahead at the Tennessee Pass siding has dropped off a pair of helpers that are now available to lend a hand. These helpers will make dragging this 8,000-ton train over the apex inside the tunnel an easier task. The westbound will now work its way past an eastbound waiting in the siding up ahead. The 10,000-foot altitude seems to emphasize the smoke that lifts straight up as the 5 units struggle up the last few hundred yards. As the westbound approaches the waiting helpers, the eastbound now has a clear main and it begins to roll down grade. AC 4400 helpers are now the mainstay helper power on the pass, and these two General Electric built units will add 274,000 pounds of tractive effort. A plus for safe train handling will also be the 160,000 pounds of dynamic brake capacity. This will come in handy to get the train down the other side with its ruling 3% grade to min-turn. Get a break with some real sunlight later on, and an eastbound manifest breaks out of the tunnel. The SD40T-2 on the point is followed by a GP60 and an SD45T-2. A Conrail and Canadian Pacific pair of leased units complete the lash up in front. Mid-train, there are no less than 4 AC 4400 helpers, adding over 17,000 horsepower to the mix. These helpers will be dropped off down at Malta. Another helper set waits on the siding to return to Minturn for another assignment. When the eastbound is clear, the automatic switch is aligned and the dwarf signal is green. It gets much tougher on the west side with a stiff 3% grade back to Minturn where the helpers are based. Before 1890 and the conversion to standard gauge, the line was even steeper with severe curves, all built on a budget by General Palmer, expanding and competing as fast as time would allow. Coping easily with a 3% grade is a pair of AC 4400s with 4 more ACs as mid-train helpers. The helpers are 50 cars back, with 39 more cars behind them. These bulkhead flat cars rolling by may look empty at a glance, but they're actually carrying heavy sheets of plate steel. These cars are maxed out with the weight of this heavy material. This is the same set of helpers that assisted the previous eastbound manifest freight over the hill when we were on the eastern side of the tunnel. Another eastbound grinds up the grade with a loaded coal train. The coal is from Arco Mine, headed to Illinois. The power on this train consists of a total of 7 AC 4400s pulling a 102-car train of over 14,000 tons. The 4-cycle diesel motors in these General Electric locomotives have a completely different sound than all the General Motors built locomotives, which all use a 2-cycle design approach. A few miles west by the timetable and north by the compass is the big curve at Mitchell. This eastbound is a Roseville, California to Kansas City manifest with 63 loads and 33 empties. The 7,000-ton train is well over a mile long. At one time, the west side was double-tracked to help cope with the problems of getting trains over such a steep grade. The Tennessee Pass route was totally under CTC control by 1928 due to the increased traffic on the line. The Rio Grande was the first railroad west of the Mississippi to use CTC. All mainline tracks on the Rio Grande were under automatic block system control by 1957. A westbound freight back at the East Tunnel portal is struggling to get over the last half mile of the 1.5% grade. The same train later on at Mitchell is running a mere 20 miles an hour, the posted limit for westbounds, to keep this train under control down the 3% western slope. Just down the line at Dean, the helper set that lifted our coal train through the tunnel's west port drifts back down grade, returning to Minturn for another assignment. This is next to Camp Hale. While chasing trains through the pass, you'll have to stop at the former location of Camp Hale, built in World War II to train troops of the 10th Mountain Division for high-altitude mountain warfare. The construction of the camp began in 1942, and housing, training, and other facilities were built in a large open field served by a spur off the Rio Grande main line. Camp Hale was named after Denver's own General Hale. Eventually, these troops faced the German army in the Italian mountains. These troops were specially trained in the use of skis, pack mules for artillery, and dogs for carrying supplies and flushing out hiding enemy troops. The 10th Mountain scattered 8 battalions of Nazi troops with the loss of 990 American men. A memorial to these men is all that remains of the camp location. Just beyond Camp Hale is Pando at milepost 288.7 with an 8,200-foot siding. We've dropped over 1,000 feet in about 7 miles. The steep 3% grade has a slight leveling off just west of Pando. This westbound St. Louis to Roseville manifest is heading for a meet at Pando Siding. It's making the allowed maximum 25 miles per hour downgrade with a pair of ACs and an SD40 tunnel motor. This is a mix that isn't seen very often. This long train of 85 cars actually took over 3 minutes to pass this location before we abbreviated it for viewing here. Braking a train of this size can be tricky on a 3% grade, so 4 rear helpers were added to bring the train down to Minturn. Until the arrival of the ACs, some heavy trains were brought down the hill in 2 sections and reassembled in Minturn up ahead for the trip westward. Down at the east end of Pando is an eastbound manifest freight waiting for the main to clear. This train is also very long and heavy, and they'll use every ounce of power to accelerate it past us in a few moments. Pando is Spanish for slow of motion, and this could be referring to the Eagle River's motion alongside the tracks, or it may even refer to the difficulty of muscling trains up this grade back in the days of steam-powered trains. In case you're wondering how they got this train up to speed so quickly up this grade, you're about to see why. The original Denver and Rio Grande extended its line west to Red Cliff by 1881 to reach additional mines. With the small town of Red Cliff in the background, we start a new day with a westbound. The crew made an unplanned stop at Pando to recharge their air supply due to the numerous brake applications coming down grade. Precautions like this are necessary to prevent mishaps and runaway trains. Just west is Belden, where the highway crosses over the tracks which enter Belden Canyon. Running east by the timetable, which is south by the compass here, is the coal train with no less than a total of 9 AC 4400 GE units in charge of this 14,500-ton train. It's hard to imagine railroading on a bigger scale than this. 3% grades, 100-car trains, and 39,600 horsepower. The spectacular highway bridge above us here is one that was built in 1940 for the U.S. Highway 24. The view from the upper bridge is a popular one for rail photographers wanting views from this high vantage point. Here, below our vantage point from the bridge, we see an eastbound manifest with a Union Pacific engine on the point, waiting for a westbound empty coal train to pass on by. It's still 25-mile-an-hour territory here in this treacherous area. Past Minturn, the speeds will pick up again. The eastbound manifest worked its way through Rock Creek Canyon a few minutes ago, and this scene points out the challenges of mountain railroading with its difficult access to many parts of the system. In 1882, the tracks ended their westward travel here to tap into mining activities. The Tennessee Pass line wasn't originally intended to be a through route until attempts to reach Grand Junction by standard gauge track were made in the Marshall Pass route to Gunnison, Black Canyon, and Montrose. This effort had too many problems to overcome, and the Tennessee Pass line was chosen for standard gauging instead. The line was completed from here to Glenwood Springs in 1886. The Marshall Pass route was abandoned by 1955, and the Black Canyon and other track segments now lie under the water of the Blue Mesa Reservoir. As difficult as the Tennessee Pass proved to be, it was still the best choice available and has served well up to present times. We're at the east end of the Minturn siding, and we'll look at the yard there in a minute. But first, we want to show you number 7312 and Company dig out of the hole up the 3% grade ahead of it. It's quite a show. This train seemed to be put into every siding as it worked its way eastward. The crew had a very long day before reaching Pueblo. These 6 AC 4400s are nearly back to Minturn Yard, where they'll wait again for the next eastbound big enough to require their help. Minturn was named after the DNRG Vice President Thomas Minturn. This location is the western end of Subdivision 4, the eastern end of Subdivision 3, and a crew change point. This is also where helpers are removed on westbounds and added on eastbounds. This yard shares cramped quarters with Highway 24, the small town of Minturn, and the Eagle River. At one time, heavy westbound taconite trains were reassembled here after being broken into 2 trains back in Pueblo. They now send the 100-car trains over in one unit since using the giant AC 4400s as helpers. We've passed the toughest part of the trip, and the remaining 40 miles from Minturn west to Dot Cerro features flatter terrain and faster running. The mountain railroading we've seen breeds an independent, almost rebellious spirit inherited from General Palmer, which remained with the Rio Grande to the end in 1988 with a merger with the larger SP. This merger proved to be too much for even the Rio Grande's personality to survive. But rail fans for years admired the Rocky Mountain-based road for its diversity of big-time standard gauge railroading mixed with narrow gauge remnants, some lasting into the 60s. The diesel era produced colorful but business-like paint schemes, instantly recognizable from a distance. Another example of the Rio Grande's independent poise was its retaining passenger train operations after almost every other U.S. road threw in the towel and turned the business over to Amtrak in 1971. The Rio Grande Zephyr, shown here, is one of these holdout trains, a vestige of the California Zephyr which ran between Oakland and Chicago. The original Zephyr was run jointly by the Western Pacific, Rio Grande, and the Burlington until 1970. Railroads weren't required to participate in the Amtrak plan if they agreed to run their passenger operations for 5 years. The Rio Grande chose to continue the operation of the train between Denver and Salt Lake and continued until 1983. After the Rio Grande bought the A-Lane SP in 1988, Rio Grande enthusiasts, as well as SP fans, began to see sets of Rio Grande locomotives in new places such as California's coastline and Donner. Even today, in the early days of the purchase by the Union Pacific, it's possible to see sets of Rio Grande locomotives. Keeping this fleet together in organized sets makes sense since they have a different maintenance history than SP locomotives of even the same model types. Leaving Minturn and traveling west again, we'll skip ahead to our destination of Dot Zero. This name allegedly comes from the old survey map inscription of Dot Zero, or starting reference point. The name was gradually changed to Dot Zero. This is where the Tennessee Pass line ties into the Moffat route mainline. The Y here gives Tennessee Pass trains 2 routing choices. The track to the west reaches the division point and crew change point at Grand Junction, Colorado. This is for traffic heading to Salt Lake City, Utah. The track heading northeast from us routes trains into the Moffat-built Denver and Salt Lake line into Denver, Colorado. The track from here to Orstad is the Dot Zero cutoff, completed in 1934, that unified the Moffat-built line with the Rio Grande. The name Orstad is simply Dot Zero spelled backwards. Here we encounter an eastbound empty vehicle carrier train heading for Minturn and its crew change point. There, the train is likely to acquire helpers. We return back to a point midway between Minturn and Dot Zero in Red Canyon at a location called Sherwood. This eastbound loaded coal train is being handled easily by 2-point AC 4400s and another pair on the rear. Only 4 units and a mere 17,600 horsepower. The grade here is only the beginning for this eastbound, which will most likely double its collection of locomotives to meet the challenge of the grade up ahead past Minturn. Highway 70 is in the background while we use the less busy State Highway 6 for our trip into Red Canyon. While in Red Canyon, we picked up a westbound manifest with a very large and eclectic assortment of motive power. We were lucky enough to follow this lash-up all the way down to Eagle, and it will give you a good look at the pleasant countryside down to Eagle, a town named for the Eagle River that follows the tracks to Dotsero, where it then runs into the Colorado River. We finally arrive at the town of Eagle and watch the train cross the Eagle River and continue its westward run. After passing through town, we pick the action back up along Highway 6 and head for a meet at Sage at milepost 332. A westbound taconite train pulls up at the west end of Sage siding and waits for an eastbound coal train in the late afternoon light of a fall day in October. The trees are in their full fall colors now. We're at Dot Cerro again just before sunrise and it's about 35 degrees. Off around the bend we hear a train and this time it's an empty coal train drifting down grade. Nothing too exciting compared to where we've been, but at least there are 3 Rio Grande units in the mix of locomotives. The last unit, number 5397, is repainted in SP colors, but the 5000 series number indicated that it was once a Rio Grande unit. Hopefully this line will remain as a routing option in the merger with the Union Pacific. There may be some competitive niche to work against the Burlington Northern Santa Fe system that everyone has overlooked so far. If the line can't do that, it's finished eventually. If Union Pacific can demonstrate smooth operation without it, it will be closed. One more piece to the puzzle is here. If you're wondering where the stack trains were, we have one. This was the only stack train that we saw in 10 days of shooting. This type of train just doesn't make sense here or on the Moffat line with UP's other options. Most of this traffic is routed on the Sunset route to the south or on the Wyoming UP main to the north. Both routes are very busy, especially the Wyoming route, and any additional traffic, such as offloading trains of any type from the Tennessee Pass, would be difficult right now. The Moffat route has its limitation that it cannot pass double stacks without upgrading around 40 tunnels. We've heard rumors that this could cost as much as 40 to 50 million to perform. Not a lot of money to a company the size of UP, but it would certainly take a while to accomplish. All these factors plug into the equation of whether or not the Tennessee Pass line has a future, or at least a delayed demise. We'd like to show you a few more trains from this scenic line, just in case they may not have a future here, so sit back and enjoy. While we watch some of the remaining Rio Grande units in various locations on the SP system, we'll give you a very brief summary of the Rio Grande's history. The Rio Grande was always plagued with problems of rugged conditions, underfunding, and stiff competition from Union Pacific to the north and Santa Fe to the south. From the Palmer days to as recently as the 1950s, the struggle weighed heavily on the line, even during the periods of World War I and World War II, when other struggling lines did quite well. Finally, by 1964, studies for a new style of operation were conducted, and by January 1965, the plan was initiated. This was the SFT plan for short, fast trains. The idea was, at first, to run shorter trains with enough locomotive power to get the speed up and be competitive. This is opposite of the style that builds monster trains for slow drag freight operation when enough equipment collects in the yards. Helpers were eliminated as much as possible on all lines except at Minturn on the Tennessee Pass. With the exception of some coal trains, the majority of other trains were given sufficient power to get by without helpers. Later on, the plan was modified somewhat to prioritize the trains into speed classes that made sense. For example, it doesn't make sense to run hotshot coal trains, but truck-on-flat car trains would want to be run nearly to passenger train standards. This plan worked, and it made better use of locomotives, track capacity, and improved crew scheduling in ways that benefited both the railroad and the workers. In short, it completely turned things around and created an aggressive little road that could compete and eventually drain away some extra business from tough competitors who were making improvements of their own. This plan made the union, the employees, the railroad management, and the customers happy. Finally, a plan that suited Rio Grande's unique circumstances. Things have changed since the Rio Grande bought the SP, and the integrated system has taken on a SP set of priorities. The added dimension of the old rival to the north, Union Pacific, buying the SP has clouded the issue even more, especially the ultimate fate of the Tennessee Pass. The Rio Grande was a very independent and at times forward-thinking line with the difficult task of operating a mountain rail line. Operating narrow-gauge equipment into the 60s contrasts heavily with being the first Western road to modernize with central traffic control. The Rio Grande was always willing to help push forward locomotive designs with the use of diesel hydraulic locomotives, SD-45 tunnel motors, and even experiments in using atomic-powered motors. Ironically, the line from Pueblo to Leadville was conceived as a branch line to tap into mining in the area. The extension to connect to Grand Junction via Dot Cerro was a secondary idea. It may well be that the line will be partly abandoned and be reduced to a mere branch line to Leadville someday. One more gem in our Rio Grande locomotive review is this GP30 that's been around the Sacramento area in ballast train service. This unit, 3008 on the point, is one of about a dozen active units left of this 1962 built locomotive. Normally, the companion GP40 is the point engine, since it has the radio equipment needed to keep in touch with the rest of SP's people. We close this presentation with a scene so representative of operations today on the Tennessee Pass. This is nearly 9 o'clock at night in a mixture of post-sunset and moonlight, with 9 AC 4400s handling an eastbound coal train.
This video was originally finished before the decision to finally close Tennessee Pass. Parts of the old Rio Grande are still used, but under the new ownership of the UP. Time and mergers are erasing scenes like these when there was a Rio Grande. Before video cameras, some folks had small 8mm film cameras that captured events that seemed ordinary enough at the time, but today they are thoughtful windows into the past. This pair of Jeep 30s is typical of a backwoods branch line operation on the Rio Grande, using track converted from old narrow gauge lines. When the weather cooperated, this was one of the best jobs someone could have, especially if they appreciated the expansive beauty of the West and working for a railroad that seemed almost like a family. This local between Ridgeway to Whitewater, Colorado, in the early 70s is one of our favorite Rio Grande scenes. This was once narrow gauge country before converted to standard gauge. The two turbocharged GP30s were once built for speed in the early 60s, but they were just as useful for branch line operation, where a little switching at the end of the run was required. The Rio Grande Zephyr was in some ways a throwback to the 50s. However, its sleek styling and good service was still a valid choice to the end of its operation in 1983. The passengers varied from tourists to people in remote communities that depended on the train for connection to the outside world. The stations varied from small facilities at Thompson to the ornate Glenwood Springs station. This Salt Lake City to Denver train featured some wonderful scenery. We'll end this video with some visual impressions of what it was like to ride a favorite of rail fans, the Rio Grande Zephyr.